He said the Israeli government needs to stop this indiscriminate killing. It needs to stop restricting humanitarian aid, stop killing civilians and aid workers, and stop using food as a weapon. Is this an appropriate characterization of what Israel is doing? And if so, do you think any of that behavior is likely to change?
Well, it's a totally understandable statement, of course, during these horrible circumstances in which these people were unjustifiably killed. I mean, I think the United States is right to condemn it. I think we're right to call for a prompt investigation. And I'm glad he expressed our outrage at the targeting. I don't think it would be an intentional targeting, however, of humanitarian aid workers. I don't think that makes sense. Now, whether they were too fast in pulling the trigger or whether they had the wrong intelligence or what, I think that's what the purpose of an investigation would be. I know John Kirby said over and over, please, let's wait to the end of an investigation. But I do think that makes sense. I mean, we should be horrified and outraged, but let's find out really what happened. I doubt it was intentional.
Even if it wasn't intentional in that it was discriminate.
Yes.
What about this idea of Israel being largely indiscriminate in the strikes that it is carrying out in Gaza, knowing that tens of thousands of civilians have died as a result of them? Does that suggest that Israel is, if not tolerant of the collateral damage is the right word, at least willing to accept a great deal of collateral damage?
I think you've put your finger right on it. I think that because of October 7th and the horrible things that happened, the Israelis feel, especially because Hamas is hiding among civilians, that that's what happens in war. And this is bound to happen because of the conduct of Hamas. And that's really an unfortunate situation there where we're all trying to make judgments which are very, very difficult from afar about what's an acceptable loss of civilian life in the middle of a war. We want it to be zero. Of course, it cannot be. But it's hard to justify what you see here today, of course. But it's really hard for us to try and unpack and untangle all the decisions that were made.
And it was brought up to me today that the U.S. has been responsible for civilian casualties. The U.S. has taken out weddings and funerals in their own strikes before. Perhaps what's different, though, is that when the U.S. is conducting its own operations with U.S. equipment, that is a kind of decision that the U.S. is making on its own, in large part. The U.S. is seeing what's happening in Israel and Gaza and still providing billions of dollars in lethal aid and in weapons to Israel, providing Israel with the means to do such things. Do you see that dynamic ever changing, or could pressure get to a point in which the U.S. has to really rethink what it's willing to give Israel if Israel is doing things like this, whether they intended to or not?
So I think Israel can't afford many more of these huge mistakes. This is just the type of thing that will increase public and U.S. policy pressure to change the United States transference of weapons policy, to put more conditions on this particular type of weaponry. The bigger the bomb, the way I understand it, is the less precise it is. And so I think it might be in the U.S. interest to try and make sure they have smarter bombs, and we urge them to be smarter about the way that they're deployed. But yeah, the way the things are going now, we're certainly urging them, but the Biden administration's not going all the way and conditioning the assistance for a change in conduct by the Israelis.
And of course, the administration is also thinking about the ultimate endgame here, whatever the day after looks like, still pushing for a two-state solution. And just on this idea of outcomes, I spoke earlier today with James Jeffrey, Wilson Center Chair of the Middle East Program, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, about how difficult the situation is. This is what he told me. Just take a listen.
If Israel were to stop this war today, as the UN seems to want, and leave Gaza, you would have 2.4 million people in the rubble, ruled by what's left of Hamas, which would simply prepare for another attack on Israel. That's not a future for the Palestinian people, too. This is a very difficult conundrum.
So he speaks about just how hard that is. Are we any closer, though, to actually figuring that out? Or is this a war now 6 months on that has no end in sight and no real conclusion, it seems, at this point?
Yeah, I think one of the things that America is trying to do is to urge upon the Israelis, hey, let's come up with a sensible post-Gaza type plan. I think, however, based on just sort of what we read and who we talk to over in Israel, that even this isn't a left-right issue there. It's more we, the Israeli people, are not in the mood to support the idea of a two-state solution under a gun, especially in the wake of the largest terrorist attack that we've ever been through. I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing for us to accept for some period of time. If I, however, were Netanyahu or over there myself, I would begin to be thinking about what we could do down the road. They've said it cannot be the Palestinian Authority because it's corrupt and ineffective. That sounds right to me. But we ought to be thinking of workarounds so that one day this can be a policeable situation, because the Israelis don't want to do it. The Israelis don't want the PA or Hamas to do it, but someone's got to do it.
Of course, this is something that has captured a lot of attention and time of the Biden administration as they work through this issue. But there was also a great deal of time today, specifically an hour and 45 minutes, that President Biden spent on the phone with President Xi Jinping, talking with an adversary, as they promised to do in the aftermath of their summit back in November, which is the last time they talked one-on-one. Laundry list of issues, we understand, they discussed on this call. What tangible, though, is an outcome from conversations like this? Or is this just talking for the sake of talking?
I think it's talking for the sake of checking in so that maybe our relations don't go further sort of in reverse or downward. I think that there are certainly issues that we probably raised with the Chinese, especially their harassment, near warlike sort of conditions between the Philippines and China, that's going on now in the South China Sea. I heard that they probably raised TikTok. And of course, Xi Jinping would want to talk about what tangibly would the United States do to ensure that Taiwan doesn't declare independence. So I think talking for the sake of talking is not a good idea, but I think they made some progress probably and had some understanding. And so I don't think there's anything wrong or inherently wrong with talking. I think it's probably a good idea, but you're right, nothing major came from it.